Hi everyone, welcome to The Hard Answers. I'm Tom Graham. Today we're going to wrap up the political ideology series. A political ideology, when it comes right down to it, is your belief about how the government should run and what it should do. What is the government's proper role? In a state of nature, everyone has perfect freedom. Most people are good, but some people are bad and will choose to use that freedom to steal, kill, rape, and enslave others. A government, very simply, is a brute created by the governed to protect them from other brutes whom would want to do them harm. The proper role of that brute is first and foremost military protection from exterior attackers, but secondarily, a police force to protect us from brutes in our own society that would harm us criminally. This government gets to remove the rights of individuals and throw them into prison. A secondary government also exists. It is the government of the marketplace, a brute in its own right. The proper role of this brute is to create rules for the marketplace, enforce contracts, and punish stealing and fraud. It also makes rules about what can be morally sold so as not to encourage people to harm others in order to sell them. It's perfectly fine to sell your own kidney, but it's not okay to sell your baby or someone else's kidney. This government gets to assess fines for bad behavior paid to the government and can recommend criminal charges to the first government. Because the government has fewer rights than the citizen, it sometimes makes rules for itself and artificial entities that it creates that it cannot enforce on private citizens. When a government grants a business special treatment in order to do business, when it allows it to incorporate and relieves the citizens owning and running it of certain personal liabilities, it gains the power to stipulate what that corporation cannot do, even if an individual can. Corporations might have to pay a minimum wage or implement an affirmative action plan, whereas a sole proprietor does not. I'm not saying a minimum wage or affirmative action plan are part of good governance. I'm just using them as an example to illustrate the difference between a corporation and an individual. A tertiary government is the civil government that is there to settle disputes between citizens concerning issues like property damages, customer disputes, slander, libel, estates, and domestic disputes, but most importantly, disputes between a citizen and the government. Anytime two citizens cannot agree on a resolution, the government becomes the arbiter of last resort. The government gets to determine who raises children, who owes who how much, etc. But this last government cannot put you in jail. Government judges, being paid for by all the people and being apportioned for life, are as impartial a dispute settler as we can achieve. The three governments have very different powers and require very different skill sets and expertise. They work together to provide an environment in which individuals can live together unmolested by foreign or domestic attackers and engage in commerce with each other fairly to pursue a concept of the good life of their own making, and live assured that if conflicts arise between citizens, a neutral arbiter will settle the disagreement. How do you achieve your government? There are three things you need to define in order to achieve your governing body: the form of government, the traits of the governed, a definition of justice. What forms of government are there? Plato proposed a republic where children are removed from their parents to be brought up by the community, where individuals are always secondary to the greater good of the republic. Aristotle believed in constitutional republics. He also believed in the individual, saying that our love and affection for our families and close friends make the fabric of society and a nation strong and allows us to evolve common values that bind us together. But Aristotle also says democracy is one of the most corrupt forms of government, and monarchies and oligarchies are the least corrupt. Hobbes showed that the only valid government authority is one created through the consent of the governed, and therefore monarchies and oligarchies are invalid forms of government. Locke then shows that the divinity of monarchy is a scam, and that all governments are corrupt and have a tendency to become despotic. Locke shows how to combine law and democracy and how to separate the powers of government and pit them against each other using a set of checks and balances so the Leviathan polices itself to ensure it does not become despotic. Locke acknowledges the second government, that of the economy, and says that capital acquisition is a moral duty because in voluntary exchange, the more you help others, the more you acquire. James Madison agreed. Locke says you loan your rights to the government, implying you can always take them back, and of course you do when you leave the regime and move to a different country. Rousseau blames all your woes on society, but he also coined the term social contract and said you give up all your rights when you join a society. He also was a big fan of communal ownership of all property and said that the key to living in peace was communal ownership of property. He also says that societies should be small and manageable. Rousseau provides no solutions for large societies. Tocqueville pointed out that America succeeded by having local governments for most decisions, putting democracy within the reach of people. Civil associations that were outside of the government deciding a plethora of issues without government intrusion. And the spirit of religion that kept people from behaving immorally, and how self-interest, well understood, forms people into regulated, temperate, moderated, foresighted masters of themselves. Since 1852, the U.S. has been, in reality, a two-party system. It has become clear that executive leaders, like monarchs of the past, seek the worship of the people, and knowing that they cannot gain the worship of all the people, they settle for half. They know that catering to the corruption of the individual will turn half the country against the other half, building a wall of human bodies between them and the separated government powers intended to check and balance them. So even though Locke minimized the known corruptions of politics, the corruption of the two-party system remains unaddressed. Tocqueville was correct to fear that the majority of poor would start voting their self-interests, and as a result we have Medicaid, Obamacare, and 47 other taxpayer-funded federal schemes to democratically redistribute wealth from the rich and middle class to the poor. This is not taxation. It is uncompensated takings, and it's immoral. It's important to realize that socialism is not evil in and of itself if it's voluntary. It's only evil if it's democratically enacted against the will of the minority. So what traits do the governed have? In the animal kingdom, mammalian societies are only altruistic towards their family and kin. Even in herds, food is only saved for kin. Although government can decide what natural tendencies are forbidden, killing, raping, stealing, enslaving, sacrificing the old and infirmed when the group is attacked, government cannot properly regulate citizens to do things considered unnatural in a state of nature. Feeding and sheltering someone you don't know is quite unnatural. Humans as a whole are territorial, protecting territorial boundaries and property claims as a means of preserving life-sustaining resources and value systems. Humans require borders and property claims. Humans will segregate themselves into solitary individual families or be hermits, or into social groups. Humans who live in large social groups need different regulation than humans who live alone or in low population areas. It is necessary to have laws that are appropriate for a city that are completely different than those that apply in the country. Human beings need to be recognized for their contribution individually, else people will work only hard enough to not get fired. This is a large reason communism fails again and again. People are not ants and should never be objectified as workers in a colony or hive. Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative said it best. People should always be treated as an end and never as a means. Communism always treats people as a means to the end of the great community. And that's another large reason it fails again and again. Humans have inalienable rights, including the freedoms to defend their lives, perpetuate their genes through procreation without infringing on others' rights, passively benefit from non-kin society, in other words, get benefit and give benefit without obligation, enter into contracts, pass their belongings and skill to their families, not pass their belongings and skill to non-families, defend themselves from those who might take their family's resources, to socialize in a large city or as a hermit, to settle conflicts, to decide to save or decide to spend everything. What is injustice? There are three things the modern state does that are unjust. 1. Paternalistic law to protect people from themselves, like seatbelt, helmet, and social security laws. Banning things that can be used responsibly, lawn darts, recreational drugs, alcohol on Sunday mornings, semi-automatic weapons. 2. Legislate morality, like anti-sodomy laws, anti-gay marriage laws, anti-drug laws, or prohibition. 3. Any democratic taxation that redistributes wealth from rich and middle class to poor without the explicit direct consent of those being taxed. This is theft. Targeted taxation that takes from the upper 20% of the population and gives to the lower 20% is equivalent to uncompensated takings and is immoral, unethical, and unjust. The government justly provides public goods. It cannot justly provide commodities to individuals without unanimous agreement. District representation for these issues is not enough to make it just. What is justice? Is liberty the most important thing to you? Should you be able to steal from or kill your neighbor and vice versa? Because that is the ultimate liberty. Doing anything you want to do anytime you want to do it. Returning to a state of nature. Is equality and safety the most important to you? What kind of equality? Equality under the law, equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, equality of wealth. Should a person who watches a basketball game get paid just as much for watching as the players get paid for playing? Is equality important enough to you that you would support a totalitarian regime and give up all your rights to achieve your conception of equality? Equality plus liberty always equals inequality. You cannot have equality without restricting liberty. You cannot have liberty without embracing equality. Inequality. Equality and security necessarily conflict with liberty and freedom, so there needs to be a balance between the two. We call that balance justice. We even represent justice with balancing scales. Justice is the practice of morality guided by reason, respecting the purpose and the honor of the activity being judged. Balancing the good and the welfare of the body politic versus the rights of the individual, always giving the individual superiority over the collective, but reasonably granting concessions for needful things that benefit the entire of the body politic. Let's go through some examples. The Second Amendment. In the U.S., we have the Second Amendment, and it does three things. 1, it guarantees the right of the individual to bear arms for personal defense. It allows the states to ensure a well-regulated militia that can be federalized to protect the country at any moment. If the federal government becomes tyrannical, the state governments have a duty to mobilize their militias and depose the federal tyranny. The states have access to jets, helicopters, drones, tanks, missiles. Every single weapon available to the federal government is also available to the state governments. But no rational person would say that individuals have the right to own a nuclear weapon and be free from government intrusion. Most would agree that individuals should not be able to own bombers with Moabs, fighter jets, Apache helicopters with Hellfire missiles, Predator drones, or tanks without heavy regulation. The line of how regulated a weapon should be is based on the principle of how lethal the weapon is. The more lethal, the more regulated. Weapons any more lethal than a machine gun are highly regulated, and some are nearly impossible for citizens to own. There is a line of what is reasonable for an individual to own without regulation, and currently that line seems to be drawn over fully automatic handheld firearms. You can still own one manufactured before 1986 for a little over $10,000 and a 3-month BATF process to permit the property transfer. So the law only banned the sale of fully automatic rifles manufactured after 1986. This was the last citizen weapons ban that actually made sense, because it was based on the principle of the lethality of the gun. The most recent assault weapon bans and even more current legislation are subjective and ban weapons based on how scary they look, or if they have a pistol grip or a barrel shroud or a telescoping stock, how many bullets the magazine holds, and whether or not they're preferred by criminals. Along that same line of reasoning, the government could ban Jif peanut butter because criminals prefer Jif. For guns, that line must be based on the principle of the lethality of the gun. The line of justice cannot be arbitrary, cannot be based on pistol grips or barrel shrouds or the color of the gun or other things that make the gun look scary. Corollaries should not be regulated, only causes should be regulated. Justice based on the arbitrary is not justice at all. When the principles of justice are made known to the citizen can breathe a sigh of relief. On the pro-gun control side, knowing the gun sales are not out of control, and on the pro-gun side, knowing that the government is not going to take your gun. Taxes. To expect that the government will provide the entitlement of protection of your rights, as well as providing a system of justice and military protection, is to accept that government taxation to pay for those entitlements is in fact just. Eminent domain. To live in a society and expect that you will have access to water, electricity, the internet, phone services, whatever, is to accept that the government is able to take certain property to ensure the economy can deliver those services to you. However, to justly take a targeted individual's property is not taxation, and the individual must be justly compensated for their loss. Jurisdiction. When do governments lose jurisdiction over the governed? When an individual or group of individuals is abandoned or unreachable by their society, when they can't count on any entitlements or protection of their rights, those individuals are back in a state of nature and must necessarily take their rights back that they loaned to the government in order to survive. They are morally free to kill and to steal to survive. In order to apply the law justly, we must always consider the circumstances under which the law was broken. Charity. What is the just thing to do with the people who fall on hard times? Charities should help them. The families, churches, their communities should help them. The society, not the government, must ensure that the conditions of its poorest citizens aren't such that they feel that society has abandoned them, and thereby regain their natural right to steal and kill to survive. The government is not the society. The government is a small part of society and should not be looked to for relief. Affirmative action. What do we do with categories of people who have been historically marginalized? Is affirmative action just? It's impossible to determine which people were directly marginalized because it's impossible for everyone to provide a documented account of how they personally were affected, with verifiable names and dates throughout history. Therefore, if we decide we should create an affirmative action program, we should not attempt to give any special benefit to one group or another, except based on current economic condition. That way, everyone in that economic condition, regardless of the historical events or lack thereof that may have gotten them there, would receive the help that they need to have an opportunity at success. Of course, how to implement such a fair system would be difficult due to the constant income and wealth mobility it would encourage. What constitutes the good and welfare of the body politic? A meritocracy. A free market is almost perfect, but it favors the born rich over the born poor. We need a system that encourages the rich to invest in the economy, but also ensures that the poor have the opportunity to participate in and thereby contribute to the economy. We should not give individuals direct benefits, so the best we can do is to ensure every child gets a good basic education in a safe school and perhaps even provide a healthy lunch, because you can't learn while you're starving. I know you're asking, why should the state provide lunches? Why aren't the parents feeding their own children? My answer is because it's far less expensive than providing orphanages. But orphanages would also solve the problem through an institution. Inalienable rights. Most importantly, the citizens' rights are superior to the government's authority. The only way the good and welfare of the body politic is served is if the government has a deep understanding that the rights of the governed existed in a state of nature before the government existed. No constitution gives anyone rights. It merely stipulates that the government must provide the entitlement of protection of those rights. With this understanding, it is simple to see why some of the framers of the U.S. Constitution were against the formation of a Bill of Rights, because they knew the people already had the rights and the government had very few loaned to them, and a Bill of Rights only acts to confuse. The U.S. Supreme Court has said the same in several cases, and even if the entire Bill of Rights was repealed in its entirety, the citizens would still have those rights. The government shall provide the reasonable entitlement of protection of natural rights through a justice system. Through establishing a justice system that protects everyone equally, a government can provide justice. But we must remember that government-provided safety and justice is contrary to liberty and therefore contrary to freedom. So some sort of balance is going to need to be struck between safety, justice, liberty, and freedom in order to achieve the good and welfare of the body politic. Border protection. Every body politic needs a strong military or border guard to protect its borders from attack or encroachment and to be ready to fight back if attacked. Which brings us finally to, what is the implementation that I prefer? I need to preface that I am now speaking about what implementation I prefer as the federal government at the federal government level in the United States. A constitutional legal system administered by a representative government elected in a democratic fashion ensures that the government's authority is derived through the consent of the people. Separating the powers of the government allows for a set of checks and balances to avoid the government from becoming despotic. Before we go any further, we also have to acknowledge where we came from. We must acknowledge that the states created the federal government and it still exists at the pleasure of the states. The states can dissolve the federal government anytime they want through an Article 5 convention. Look it up, it's in the Constitution. Before the states united, they were and still are countries with their own governments, their own laws, police forces, systems of justice, and their own militaries. Our federal implementation must provide a system of parallel sovereignty, and people should take that to heart when debating things like the Electoral College. For those things the federal government has power over, its power must be supreme. But all the other things are the purview of the states, and the people and their power must remain unchallenged by the federal government. This necessarily means that the federal government can never command the state governments to do anything. The states can voluntarily enforce federal law, but can never be forced to. But at the same time, they can never take action impeding federal authorities from enforcing the federal law. The federal government can, however, command the state governments to stop doing something that is unconstitutional or that impedes federal law enforcement, just as a state judge can press charges against a local sheriff that impedes a state police investigation or arrest. As a check against federal power, and the courts interpreting more powers to the federal government than the states intended, the state legislatures must have the power to amend the Constitution without approval of the federal government. On the same note, the states must always have the power to secede from the Union by petition, and the Union must always grant the state's petition as long as the state makes arrangements to pay its apportioned part of the United States national debt and negotiates for the reduction of that debt in exchange for the return of certain Union property on state soil. Now we need to define what powers to give to the Leviathan. Governments obviously need the power to tax, to pay for needful things, but this should be limited to a small percentage of the previous year's GDP. That percentage in the US today is rather high. To pay our current obligations, it would need to be set at 18 to 20% of our GDP. The rate it should be set to is closer to 8 to 10%. Not only does this new rate adjust the government's revenue as the GDP grows and shrinks, it limits the size of government and limits the scope because a government that cannot pay for new programs will not implement new programs. It also removes the ability of the government to stimulate the economy today at the cost of our children's future earnings. By placing the limit, we are saying that things like healthcare, feeding the poor, and caring for the elderly are not functions that the federal government should be involved in. If our borders are being attacked, this limit can be suspended to raise needed monies to fund a domestic war. It should also have the power to borrow, but only amounts that it can repay within 30 years, and it must never borrow to fund war overseas. A balanced budget, including repayment of debt, must be a requirement, else we will borrow in bad times and spend more to stimulate the economy. Then, when the good times roll, we'll just increase spending without paying the debt down. The economy should be at the will of the people, not the government. If the economy is bad, the banks and the business owners need to make it better without the government. If the people want to get involved in a war overseas, then the government must raise the funds before going to war from voluntary war donations. Not by borrowing money and not through taxation. If the people truly want to go to war, they will make the necessary voluntary contributions. History indicates that governments that are allowed to create fiat money typically bankrupt the country, so the government should only be able to make gold and silver coins into money. Private, local, state, and national banks should be in charge of the creation of bank money, debt instruments that are exchanged as money as long as no fraud is occurring, and each bank belongs to one or more reserve systems in case of regional runs. The second government will make information available on the real holdings of each bank and the reserves so the consumer can make informed decisions as to what banks are the most stable. All benefits the government provides must be provided equally without means testing, because means-tested benefits incentivizes free riders. Instead, anything the people believe is a reasonable entitlement must be provided to all through government institutions or equal value vouchers for private services, protection of rights through the court system, education through public and private schools, healthcare through public and private hospitals, care for orphans through public and private orphanages. I'm not saying we should have any of these, they are just examples of how to deliver benefits through institutions rather than giving financial benefits directly to individuals. The best and most proper benefit that the government can provide is information. Information about product safety, about companies polluting the environment, about drugs that claim to cure disease. Citizens can use this information to sue companies that sold them bad products and incentivize them to clean up their act. Governments should be able to provide this information, but every citizen ought to be able to make up their own mind about how much risk they allow themselves to take, which also means fewer civil suits. Governments should not be allowed to ban drugs, lawn darts, or Ford Pintos because it has decreed them too unsafe. They should only be able to provide information and require the manufacturers of the products to include large, highly visible safety rating labels. Governments should not be allowed to force you to wear a seatbelt. They should only be allowed to provide information on how unsafe it is to drive without one. They may, however, require you to strap your child in because children are incapable of informed consent. The government must have the power to function outside the Constitution when dealing with aggressive foreign state actors, but never to suspend the rights of the citizens. It must have the power to form a military, a justice system, and a police force. What are the entitlements that a citizen can reasonably expect? First and foremost, protection of our borders from foreign attack. This is a fairly straightforward and is accomplished through an institution called the military that constantly gathers intel on other countries and their movements. Secondly, protection of our rights from our fellow citizens. This one is a little tricky. The institutions that provide protection of this sort are the police force and the justice system, both of which must treat everyone equally under the law. Citizens have a reasonable expectation that the government will provide legal remedies in the marketplace to ensure contracts are enforced, fraud is punished, and stealing is prohibited, but also that contracts were entered into without coercion and with informed consent. Another reasonable, although collectivist, entitlement may be a fair start for every child to promote a meritocracy. Citizens can reasonably expect that their children receive a safe and healthy education until they reach the age of majority or graduate from high school, whichever comes first. This means increased police presence in high-crime neighborhoods and maybe even in the schools where crime might be affecting K-12 education. This also means that school lunches and maybe even breakfast should be freely available to all K-12 students to ensure the students are healthy enough to learn. And finally, it may also mean providing safe transportation to and from school for K-12, which may require a police officer on the bus. Well-educated children are productive workers seeking their own conception of the good life productively, which helps the entire society without creating a culture of free riders. In summary, the United States government is the best government on the planet, but here are the changes that I would want to see. The government should be free to treat non-citizens outside of the borders any way it wishes without regard to their basic human rights. Although in peacetime it should respect everyone's human rights, in defense of the country it is free to act any way it deems appropriate. Any state should be free to secede from the Union as long as they make arrangements with the U.S. Congress to assume their apportioned part of the United States debt. Government benefits must be provided equally to all citizens. No means testing of benefits. All benefits are equal and delivered through institutions and in the form of services or information. We should try to ensure it a meritocracy by providing a safe education for all children that will enable them to compete fairly in the economy and become productive members of society. The government's power to tax should be limited. Cap it at 8 to 10% of the previous year's GDP. Mandatory spending should not be permitted. Remove the power to borrow to pay day-to-day bills. The power to borrow can only be used if our borders are being attacked, and the money raised can only be used to protect us from attack. The government may not create paternalistic laws. The government may not force you to do something that's in your best interest. This conflicts with your right to create your own conception of a good life. And finally, most importantly, all laws must be based on principles of justice, not on arbitrary reasons. So after you get beyond all the technical aspects of government, its form, its authority, its limits, its proper role, checks and balances to ensure it doesn't get out of control, then you need to figure out what's most important. Equality and safety, liberty and freedom, or justice? For me, it's justice every time. Thank you for watching. Please click the subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this. If you disagree with me, please leave a comment. My ears are always open, and I learn new things every day when people disagree with me. I'm Tom Graham. I'll see you next time on The Hard Answers.